If you have your Bible, I want to encourage you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. That's where we're going to be at today, chapter 10. And as always, throughout this series, if you have any questions during the message, feel free to text those in to the number that's going to be up on the screen throughout the message today. That is the way to send in your questions. So answer one today and the rest on our weekly podcast. All right, chapter 10, we are dealing with idolatry today, which is everyone's favorite subject, I know, so we're going to dig into it. The first question I want to start us off with today is this, is what does it mean to fall into temptation? Why don't you pause and answer that for yourself right now? A lot of today is a lot of reflection upon our heart and where we're at. And the question I want to start off with is, what does it mean to fall into temptation? And I think that this can mean a number of different things for different people. For some people, to fall into temptation means that you're trying to stick to a certain diet, and then it's like a birthday, and there's this big piece of cake in front of you, and you're just gonna resist the temptation. Or for others, you're out shopping, or maybe you shouldn't be shopping, but somehow you found yourself at the mall and you end up buying something you don't really need, but you like it. You just really wanted it. Years ago, I was talking with someone, and this guy, and he's like, yeah, when I have a bad day, I just like to go and buy like a new pair of jeans. And I'm like, yeah, it's one way to handle a bad day. It also equals he didn't have enough money in his bank account. But anyways, growing up in the church, giving into temptation meant a few key things. Like one was, make sure you don't go too far with your girlfriend, or make sure you don't go to a party where you can face that temptation where you're going to get drunk. And there's these certain things that you had to really avoid in high school. But ultimately, all of those things are just symptoms of a bigger issue. Our biggest temptation that we actually face is the temptation towards idolatry. All of those things I just mentioned, and I will give you some more illustrations soon, all of those things are actually just a symptom of this bigger issue of idolatry. And to start off the message today, I think it's so important that we really understand what idolatry really means biblically. Idolatry is when you place anything above God in your life. And you know that you are facing idolatry when you look to anything other than God for your happiness and for your security. And the way that this plays out is that idolatry is such an issue because nearly every problem in the world around us can actually be boiled down to this one thing. We have war in the world because there are people who crave power and authority above all else. And they're willing to do whatever it takes in order to achieve that primary thing in their life. This is why there's so many people who boldly proclaim that they are a workaholic, that they are just working away at their job or their business because they find ultimate security in the money that they have. It's why so many marriages fail, is because there's at least one person, or maybe both, in that relationship that are desiring to put themselves and their happiness first above everyone else. The conflict happens on social media because we think being right will make us happy. And so I don't know about your specific situation, but what we do need to understand is that our lives get jacked up because of idolatry. And so we need this bigger view of what idolatry is, because I think for a lot of us, when I mention the word idolatry, especially if you grew up in the church, idolatry is kind of like, as long as I don't have this golden idol in my life, then I'm fine. And the reality is that for, in some place in the world, like this truly is an issue. I just this week I was watching a video, ironically enough, it was this video of this guy who's traveling throughout Venezuela. and he was in the capital city there and just kind of walking around and really exploring the city and showing what it's like to live there. And he was saying that he was going into a very dangerous area of the city where, usually you don't want to travel to. And so he stopped at a store on his way there, and he wanted to pick something up. Now, in Venezuela, they have a lot of syncretism there. And so he went into the store, and there are these little tiny statues that you could take and put it typically into your home or carry it around with you, and this would be the thing that would give you protection. And so there's all these little figurines of Jesus and of Mary. And he said, these are the traditional ones in that country, and yet there are these other small little idols that you can get of different people that you can keep with you that will give you protection. And so he showed that there were these little tiny figurines of these guys, images of these gang leaders in Venezuela, that you could keep this with you that will give you protection. So it's like, do you want Jesus or do you want this guy who's holding a gun? Like, which one do you want? And you keep that with you. This guy, he chose one that looked like him. He's like bald with glasses. He just walked around with this weird little figurine that looks like him. It's really, really surreal. And so when we think about idolatry, like, yes, there's an issue of like that in the world, but for so many of us, it's harder to identify. It's harder for us to see. What it actually comes down to is an issue of the heart. Tim Keller wrote a book on idolatry called Counterfeit Gods. And this is one way that he described it. And Tim Keller, he was a pastor in New York City. He just passed away this week, a man of great influence. So I felt definitely, since he wrote the book on it, need to quote Tim Keller today. So here's what he said. He said that an idol is whatever you look at and say, in your heart of hearts, if I have that, then my life has meaning. Then I'll know I have value. Then I'll feel significant and secure. It's an issue of the heart. And the question we have to ask ourselves is what is your heart truly after today? What is that thing that you feel like will give you true meaning, significance, and security in your life? As we study 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul, he's giving a number of warnings to the church in Corinth. And his biggest warning that we read about, is in chapter 10. And this is the biggest warning that he gives, this warning of don't be idle with your idols. Paul knows that when we have idols in our lives, that we actually need to do something about it. And so a key verse is verse 14, where he says, "Therefore, my beloved, flee idolatry." After everything he has said, and we're going to dig into it, but he says, "My beloved, flee from idolatry." This is his command, his imperative to us. His great piece of advice is flee. It is run. See the danger that is in front of us. Now, the advice like this really only truly makes sense when we actually really begin to understand the danger associated with this. When we see the true danger. I have a friend who, shortly after high school, had the opportunity to go on a mission trip to Uganda. And so he went with a group of people, and he was just right out of high school, and he's in this country where he doesn't know much at all. So him with this group, they have a guide that's going to show them around and help protect them because they're going to some really remote areas. And so this guide, he knew his assignment. And so he went up to this group, the group of all teenagers essentially, or young 20-year-olds, and he says, "Hey, you don't know the dangers in this country. You just don't, because you're not from here. You're from North America. You don't know the dangers. So when we're traveling, when we're walking from one village to another, here's what you need to understand. When I say stop, you need to stop. And when I say run, you need to run." And so, they hear all this, and so they're out the following day. They're out in the field, kind of working in the garden, kind of clearing some land. One guy has kind of a rake. He's clearing some land, and they pull back some of the bushes, some of the dirt, and where he sees this giant snake in the ground. And the guide, luckily, was right there beside him, and he yells out in this deep voice, "Kill it before it kills us all." And he takes his axe, chops its head off, and then they just go on with their day. And so the guide, he knows his assignment. This is the kind of guide that Paul is in this passage. He knows that idolatry isn't something that you want to mess around with. And he knows how easy it is for us to not even see it, to not even see how it's taken over our lives. And so the whole point of today is I just kind of want to pull it back and just kind of reveal to our hearts what idols do we have? What do we need to deal with today? And really my hope is that for all of us, myself included, is that we'll spend time with God today asking Him that He would reveal these things in our lives, because there is no one in this room that is immune from having idols begin to creep up in our lives. There's no one here that is immune from this, that there are things in your life that want to steal your affection from Christ. And so it's incredibly important that we understand this, that we learn how to see these idols around us. And so the way that Paul describes this, the way that he helps us, is he actually digs into history. If you've been around Forward for a while now, you know that last year we studied the book of Exodus, and what he does is, we took a few months, in about 5 verses. So he does a great job of doing that. And he sticks to the old adage, which is true, that those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. So let me read for us here, starting off in verse 1, where he says this, "I want you to know, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud." This is referencing the cloud that they would follow into the wilderness. They're all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food. And they all drank the same spiritual drink. And they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them. And the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Here's the first thing I want us to see in this passage, is that your past success doesn't determine your future success. The Israelites received just a ton of blessings from God, both physical and spiritual blessings. So you go through that passage, the word that you see over and over again is the word all. They all received this. They all saw the cloud. They all escaped out of slavery. They all had the manna. They all crossed the Red Sea. They all experienced this, that God just poured out a blessing and blessing upon them, that this is what they all received during this time. And yet, in the midst of all of that, they still fell into temptation. Verse 5, again, I'll read. It says, "Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness." Even after experiencing all of that, they were overthrown. They had all the success, but it didn't last. What we learn from this is that over time, they allowed old patterns of sin to creep back into their lives. They allowed it to come back. Old patterns of sin are incredibly powerful. It's important that we realize that if you face a temptation in the past and you gave yourself into it, that is going to be an area of ongoing temptation for us. So understand what this looks like, it's interesting to listen to people who have truly dealt with sin in their past. Thinking of those who dealt with addiction and were able to overcome it. It's so interesting listening to addicts who have truly understood how much that substance had over their lives. So a while ago, I was listening to a story of a man who was addicted to a number of drugs and alcohol, and he had to spend a number of, I don't know how much time he spent in rehab, but he had to go back several times to deal with this. And he explained, kind of on the other side of that, how powerful that addiction, how much power it had over his life. And he told the story about how he took his dog into the vet, and the dog had to have surgery. And after the surgery, the veterinarian gave him some painkillers for his dog. And the veterinarian doesn't know that this guy's a former addict, that the drugs he gave him are essentially the same drugs that this guy was addicted to. And he said in that moment, as the doctor handed it to him, this flash just went through his mind in a moment of how exactly he was going to hide these pills from his family. He knew exactly how he was going to use them. He kind of pictured all out, kind of step by step, of how he was going to give himself fully back into the substance that he knew wrecked and ruined his life. And then he took that bottle and he quickly handed it to his wife and said, "Hide this somewhere where I have no idea where it is. Not in the house, keep it far from me," because he knows that this old pattern still has a hold of his life. And it's the same thing for us, that our old patterns of idolatry are ready to take us down. And we need to be aware of that so that we know if you have felt tempted, to give yourself over to pornography, if you have felt yourself tempted to allow yourself just to be consumed by your work, regardless of whatever your family wants you to do, but you just need to dig into that, whatever area that you need to deal with, understand that is going to be an ongoing area of temptation. That you might have a great track record of dealing with that, but it doesn't mean that there's a guarantee of safety for tomorrow. And I mean, to explain this, I just saw a trailer for, and I think the movie or documentary just came out about Hillsong and one of their pastors who fell, who cheated on his wife, and kind of this ongoing saga of celebrity pastors who have fallen into temptation. And the reason why we read and hear about stories like this is because there's someone who received a blessing and it was profound, and yet they didn't have the safeguards in their life anymore. And so you might have a great background, but you might work hard, but understand that those aren't the things that will hold you in your relationship with God. The thing that sustains us isn't our talent or our hard work. Rather, it is the blood of Christ. This is the doctrine of perseverance. What Jesus is saying is that, hey, it's not up to you. We need to trust that He is the one who's going to hold on to us. Well, we aren't trusting the fact that, hey, you're from a good family. Hey, you're able to overcome sin in your life. The thing that you are holding on to is the one who is ultimately able to give us freedom, the one who is ultimately able to rescue and free our souls. And so he says, hey, don't be looking to that, but also at the same time, hey, understand that your past failure doesn't need to determine your future failure. The Israelites had so much success, and yet they also had tons of failures. And he explains in verses 6 to 11 four major issues that the Israelites faced. That they allowed themselves to give themselves into pagan practices. They indulged in sexual immorality. And then he says, some just put God to the test. And then others, they grumbled. To me, this is such a fascinating list because I think the first two kind of make the most sense to us. First he's talking about, pagan practices. They're kind of dancing around. And he's saying, like, hey, this is what they gave themselves over to. And then sexual immorality. And then the last two, he's like, hey, God, putting God to the test, or even just grumbling. That these are major issues. And so all of it can be summed up in chapter 7 where he says, do not be idolaters as some of them were. All of this is underneath this heading of idolatry. Understand that idolatry can express itself in so many ways. I don't have time to go through all of them, but just look at the word grumbling. What grumbling against God, what ultimately that means is that, hey, I have a better plan than God has for my life, and I'm unsatisfied in this moment. And this can have a powerful effect upon us. C.S. Lewis, he wrote a book called Screwtape Letters, which is a fascinating book, kind of all talking about spiritual warfare and temptation. And so what he tells the story of this old woman who is very polite and nice to everyone that she sees, but always is kind of unsatisfied with something, always grumbling about something. Hey, thanks for making me toast this morning, but hey, you kind of burnt the edges. Oh, thanks for bringing me to church, but I don't really, the music wasn't quite the way I want it to be. Just kind of slowly, just quietly grumbling about thing after thing. And in the way that C.S. Lewis described it in his book is that general discontentment is the way that Satan was driving a wedge between her and God. Something as small as grumbling to say, hey, God, I have a better plan. If you just look to me for some advice, like, hey, I'll tell you how this thing needs to be run here. That's putting ourselves above God. That's what idolatry ultimately comes down to, is saying, hey, my way is better. But here's the good news in this passage, is that failure doesn't mean that we have no hope for the future. Though this passage deals with tough issues, at its core, this is a message of hope. Verse 11 says, now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction. He's saying, hey, all of this happens so that we would have a better understanding. Understand that, the enemy would want you to crumble into shame. But what he wants to do in this moment is to bring up all these failures into your mind so that you would see, hey, God, I failed in 100 different ways just yesterday. Like how on earth could I actually have a good relationship with you? Satan wants you to crumble under that shame, but God has a bigger plan for you. That even in those failings, that God can use that part of your story to be a blessing to the people around you. Just look at Paul, how he, before he became a believer, he would actually be able to say that he loved the law of God more than he actually loved God himself. And he was willing to persecute and kill the Christians around him because he didn't understand what they were talking about. And then God rescued and transformed him, and now he's able to use that experience of idolatry to explain the gospel to others. You have no idea how God might use your story. As painful as it is, as hard as it is to explain to others. This is why there's such a blessing in us of living in community with each other so we can be honest as we gather together here on Sundays or in our discipleship groups, so we can actually share what has happened in our lives so that we would actually be able to help someone else to say, hey, I can relate to your situation. This is what happened to me. Let me point you back to Jesus. That you might have fallen in the past, but your future can be different. And so there are two things that we can count on. Two things that Paul points out in this passage that we can be counting on today. First, that we can count on God's grace. At the core of this entire passage is verse 13. It says, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. Hey, this is going to happen. But God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. Understand, in God's grace, that he is faithful to us. He is faithful when we have been unfaithful to him. One of the craziest books in the Bible is the book of Hosea that describes the faithfulness of God. The entire book serves as this illustration. And it's a brutal illustration. God tells the prophet Hosea, he says, hey, I want to use your life as an illustration of what my relationship with the people of Israel looks like. And so, Hosea is like, great, love to be used by God. What's the plan? God says to him, hey, I want you to go and marry a prostitute. And so he goes and he marries her, and she is completely unfaithful to him. He marries her, rescues her from that life. They have a family together, and she runs back into this temple prostitution she'd been involved with. And then he goes back to her again to rescue her, faithful to her who is unfaithful to him. And all of this is to be served as an illustration of God's faithful, that he is the faithful, loving husband, and that we would be like the unfaithful prostitute, which is not a flattering illustration at all. And yet it shows how deep God's love is for us and how terrible sin looks in his eyes. And he says, hey, there is nothing that you can do. There is absolutely nothing that you can do that God would want to turn his back on you, that he would want to come and rescue you. Out of his love, God promises this, that he is faithful to us. We just need to turn to him. Out of his love, God promises that in this, he will help us. He will help us when we face temptation. This passage, he's talking about the temptation that we're going to face, and he says that he is holding back the temptation that we could potentially face. He says that he's going to hold back these floodgates so that nothing that we face should overcome us. And in these moments, that he is willing to provide for us an escape. He's going to provide for us a way out of that situation. And what he isn't saying is that he's going to totally eliminate temptation from our lives. I mean, we still have a free will. We can still choose to run far from him. But he's saying that if we are looking towards him, that he is willing to rescue us from whatever situation we might face. Are we just willing to take that escape? That we need to lean on his grace and ask God to actually show us the way out of that temptation. Lord, help us to understand what does it mean to actually put you as first and foremost in our lives. And that can be that can be challenging because I think the way that we often want an escape hatch to appear is that, just kind of open this up and you just walk yourself into, just this really easy situation. But God might be calling us to sacrifice. He might be calling you away from a really comfortable situation. What does it mean to actually place God as first and foremost in your life? It means actually cutting some things out. But we can count on God's good grace to us. But on the flip side of that, we need to understand that we need to count on our own weakness. We need to come face to face with our reality that we aren't as strong as we would hope we are. That we actually are weak. Paul gives this warning in verse 12. He says, "Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall." That if you think that you're strong, that you don't need God in your life, that's actually entering into really dangerous territory. And this affects all of us. A few weeks ago, there was an elders meeting at Forward, and one of the elders just started sharing about what's going on in his life and what God has been revealing to him of some idols they had in his life. And we asked him to record what he shared in that meeting for us to watch today, because I think it serves as this great example of hey, whether you are new to the faith or you're a pastor or an elder, that this is something that all of us are going to have to deal with. And so we're going to watch that on the screen right now as he just kind of shares how God's been working in his life. So let's watch that together.
We've all heard verses in Exodus 23-6 a million times. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. When I think back to my life before Jesus, I've had many idols. Career, title, finances, my own kids, materialism, sports, whether playing them or watching the Leafs, the Jays, or Eagles. That was my life. But as I've grown in my walk with Christ and the pursuit of being more like him in my life, I found my desire for those things wane. Career, title mean absolutely nothing anymore. I'm still working hard on not caring about finances, but that's a work in progress. I've even stopped caring to watch a baseball game and can't get through a Leaf game or football game. I find the pursuit of these worldly things meaningless. Golf and hockey, which I used to worship, have even lost their fulfillment. My fulfillment only comes from Christ. In Philippians 3 verse 8, in the Message, Paul says, the very credentials these people are waving around as something special, I'm tearing up and throwing in the trash, along with everything else I used to take credit for. And why? Because of Christ. Yes, all the things I once thought were so important are gone from my life. Compared to the high privilege of knowing Christ Jesus as my master firsthand, everything I once thought I had going for me is insignificant, dog dung, rubbish. I've dumped it all in the trash so that I could embrace Christ and be embraced by him. I thought I was on the right track myself and feeling pretty good about how far I've come with these idols in my life, until the Lord hit me right between the eyes listening to a David Platt sermon on the idolatry of comfort. He talked about our pursuit of comfort, health, and safety. And it made me reflect, are we comfortable in our Christian walk and our Canadian lifestyle? Do we pursue comfort in our homes, our status, our religious activities? But what about our health or the health and safety of our kids? Do we pursue our best life now as what the world deems as important? Have we gotten too comfortable? Has this lifestyle penetrated our lives of our church or as leaders of the church? Suffering becomes a gift when treasuring God above all is the goal. If God takes it all away, will we still find joy? As Derek said last Sunday, Jesus came down from the comfort of heaven, gave up everything, had nothing on this earth, no possessions or money or a home, suffered unbelievable ridicule, was abandoned by his friends, was beaten and nailed to a cross. He suffered and ultimately died for us so we could gain. We need to remind ourselves and others in our church that we are suffering, that they are suffering, that no pain or loss can rob us of the treasure if we make Christ our life and die to the things of this world.
I love how he explains that in such practical ways of how sports, how finances, how these things have this way of taking over our lives. As Paul concludes this section, verses 14-22, he explains how we have such a hard time that we are unable to separate our actions from worship. That it's so easy for us, whatever we're involved with, is to begin to actually worship that thing. to begin to worship sports, to begin to worship our job. He says that, in our weakness, we're unable to separate these things. And he gives the illustration in verses 16 and 17. He says, hey, look to the Lord's Supper. Through the bread and through the cup, that's how we worship God. And the verse 18 says, this is how it was in the Old Testament in the temple, that through that meal, that's how that they would worship. And now the cultural issue that they're dealing with in this moment is about eating food that's been offered to idols. We talked about this a few weeks ago, that, these idols, that these aren't true gods. And yet he says that there is a spiritual implication here. That we might know and understand that these aren't gods, and yet are we able to actually prevent ourselves from worshiping them? Verse 19 and 20 says, what do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? Verse 20, no, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. He says that we're involved in a spiritual warfare. And so the enemy, if he can't shame you on your past, then what he wants you to do is to embolden you into foolishness. These are the two things, either shame or embolden you into foolish acts, thinking that you are strong and able to not give your heart fully over into these things. And so the final warning that Paul gives here in verse 22, it says, shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? He says, hey, have you given your full affection to him? Understand that God is a jealous God, that he wants all of you. Because as a good and loving God, that's what he deserves. He deserves all of your heart, all of your affection. Are we stronger than he? God knows who we are, and he knows our weakness. He knows that our hearts are prone to wander, prone to worship anything other than him. And so this is what he does for us, is that he fights for us. That through sending himself, by sending Christ to us, that he would come to rescue us from this. And this is where we need to land today, is that we can find hope in God today. That no matter what is pulling at your heart, that you can turn back to him and say, God, help me in this situation. Help me to have a bigger and better view of you today. This is the hope that we can have. And so I want to call up the worship team. And we're going to worship in this moment, understanding just what Christ has done for us. The rescue that he has provided for us. And so as the team is getting ready, let me pray for us today. Lord Jesus, I thank you that you came to fight for us, that you saw our weakness, you saw the temptations that we face in the world around us, and you decided not to leave us there, but actually to come around us. And so, Lord, I pray that all of our hope would be placed in you today. All of our trust, all of our affection would be given to you this morning. Lord, we pray this in your precious name.